I think we are ready to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Africa Rising, How Fast. This session is going to be looking at the opportunities that are across the continent, where the future lies for Africa. And we are very fortunate to have an esteemed panel of men. Lucky that there is a woman at the helm. These are fabulous men, are all working on the ground across the continent and really have a brilliant perspective into what doing business and doing big business is like in Africa and in various regions across the continent as well. So we'll start with, we have Mark Cutis. Now Mark is the Chief Investment Officer and Special Situations at Abu Dhabi Investment Council. He joined the Investment Council in 2008. From 2004 until 2008, he worked at Shinsei Bank as their Chief Investment Officer, and before that was at HVB, and has many years of experience investing all over the world. And so really, I think the great thing about having you here, Mark, is it'd be great to get your perspective in terms of the difference in doing business in Africa as opposed to elsewhere. To my right, we have Jay Ireland. Jay is the President and CEO of GE Africa. He has overseen the company's growth to more than 1,800 employees with more than $2.4 billion in revenue. And I think the wonderful thing about having you here, Jay, is it'd be brilliant to get your perspective in terms of how things have changed from when GE first entered the continent. And then to my left, we have Kola Karim, CEO of Shoreline Energy International. Kola is the Group Managing Director and is leading the energy infrastructure of the company, which works across sub-Saharan Africa. And then next to Kola, we have Ben Kruger. Ben is the joint CEO of Standard Bank Group and Chairman of Standard Bank PLC, where he is in charge of personal and business banking as well as corporate investment banking. He also serves as Chairman of Standard Bank PLC since joining. And then finally, last but by no means least, we have a bit of a rock star on the business scene in Africa. You got your guitar, Vimal. Vimal Shah, CEO of Bidco Group, a manufacturer and marketer and distributor of edible oils, fats, hygienic products. They are across all of the eastern region and southern region of Africa. And Vimal has been a big player in terms of really sort of highlighting to the world what the opportunities are in terms of doing business in Africa. So, as you know, the statistics speak for themselves. I think we have some slides that have some stats. There is over 5% annual GDP growth between now and 2019. It's making Africa the second fastest growing region in the world after developing Asia. Foreign direct investment has more than tripled in the past 10 years. Africa is projected to have the world's largest population by 2050. But we do know there are problems there. There is still a total infrastructure gap, which is estimated to be around 2 trillion annually until 2020. It also has a very young population. And what are the opportunities and also the challenges of having a population that is so young? So as I said, we're going to start with one question that I think maybe all of you can answer, and then I'll go and sort of drill down more individually. So we'll start with you first, Mark. What do you think in terms of the continent, really how different it is in terms of doing business in Africa, and you can go by countries as well, to doing business around the world? Because obviously, as we know, when you invest in Japan or China, culturally there are differences. So what are the cultural differences in Africa?
So obviously Africa has over 50 countries.
Of course.
So we can't really generalize.
And my family are from Ghana, which is a very great country in Africa.
So you can't generalize. So it's not like saying, what's it like doing business in Japan?
No.
So clearly you have more opportunity than you have in many places, but the ticket size is smaller. Which means that by definition, you have to take a view that you're going to grow your participation and your involvement in the country.
Right.
In the countries. And you're going to have to pick some countries where you're going to spend more time and more effort. But what makes Africa also very interesting, apart from the demographic factor that you mentioned, and you have all the associated opportunities, which is like including manufacturing, because most people think about extraction industries, is that in many ways Africa is redefining banking.
Right.
And I just want to talk about M-Pesa for a moment, the ability to use the payment systems way in advance of where many European
we are
and
way
Western.
behind. Yeah.
So there are some interesting big opportunities, small opportunities. The key factor for participating in Africa is you have to be there. And I think Jay will speak to that because he's actually made his home there.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. I know you just moved to London, so I apologize for saying that. But you really have to be closer to where the action is if you want to participate.
Fabulous. Jay?
Well, I did move there. I haven't seen Nairobi in a while. Been bouncing around different countries in the continent. And I think that's one of the key things is even within Africa, I talked to a number of other leaders of businesses and responsibility for Africa, and they'll be in Dubai, they'll be in London or Paris because it's so-called easy to get in and out. And even if I'm in Nairobi, but even still, you've got to be in Nigeria and Ghana, South Africa, Angola, Cameroon, everywhere where we're operating. And I think that's the key because I view Africa as it's a relationship culture generally.
Yes.
We do a lot of work with governments around infrastructure projects and things, and it's important to understand, obviously, not just the people, but also how the governments operate, what some of the history is, so you understand the local anomalies around things.
And culturally how things are done,
culturally,
country to country.
Right, and so it's very important from a standpoint of being there. And it's one of those things that living there, I think as a multinational, gives you a little bit more credibility when you go talk to people. Because I live with the same issues that everybody else does. My generator kicks in for half a day, every other day. I can't get it. It takes an hour to drive 6 kilometers. No, we don't make those little diesel generators. Our goal is to make sure no one has to have them anymore. Right? And I'm stuck in traffic. I deal with all the other issues that everyone else deals with. So I think that's been important for us. And I think the other big thing for anybody that's going to come, and this is one of the things for me, is we had to convince, not overly convince, definitely not our CEO, but the rest of the business leaders and stuff that, hey, this is the place that's going to be a growth area with its issues and all the other things, but fundamentally, and we've been able to. Our revenues are a little higher than what you said. Those are a couple years old.
So what are they, please?
I can't tell until we report earnings. These guys will do something with the stock. Hopefully buy more.
Have me buy more.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's a great area. You've got to focus in on making sure that everyone is behind you in your company as well, because the say-do thing is a key thing. And we talked about this earlier. Everybody says, the governments and whatever, they look in business. And I said, there's a lot of times businesses come into the governments and said, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do that. And then they walk away. And so we've got a little bit of credibility, things that we as in industry has to prove too, that we are going to be there for the long term.
For the long term,
And we are investing, and I think we've done a lot. I won't go through that, but I think that's a key thing.
Yeah, well, we can come back to that a bit later. And so, Kola, obviously, you are African, born and bred, and you started and grew your business there along with your partner. So for you, what do you think the cultural differences are in that it's innate for you because you just obviously understand them, being African? It's not something you've had to learn.
No, but the thing you need to think about looking at doing business on the continent is simple. Always apply the same principles you apply anywhere else in the world, as in the standards of doing business.
Okay.
That's the first rule to the game. Don't think because it's Africa, we're going to apply a different rule. That way you get a different outcome. That's the key driving principle of what people looking at Africa should try apply. The second thing is, it's a diverse continent.
Yes.
You need to try and appraise where your entry point is, where your weak point is.
Yeah.
Then looking at the opportunities itself, appraise these opportunities and making sure these opportunities fits your rate of return as per the investment you want to make on the continent. That way you'd sort of get it right. That's the way to appraising doing business in Africa.
Yeah.
Now, as an African operating in Africa, we sit there and we see these opportunities because we live it daily.
Yeah.
And by living it, we experience it. That way we could measure it where we want to be. For us as a business, we decided our focus is going to be around infrastructure, natural resource,
Yes.
because we can see the deficits.
Yes.
In making that happen, you need one critical element, and that's filling the gap with capital. But today, what has happened in the world, looking at Africa and the way Africa is responding to this, African financial institutions are standing up to the plate. 10 years ago, a financial institution on the continent, I'll give an example, in Nigeria, to do a transaction of $50 million would either take about 3 or 4 banks to write that check.
Wow.
But today, you have financial institutions in Africa, in Nigeria, writing checks of $300-400 million. So the game is changing.
It's changed.
So the reality is that confidence
And
in
it's
itself.
been rapid change.
It's
as well.
rapid change, but that's helped us as African entrepreneurs to step up our game in trying to do bigger and better transactions, but basing it all on international standards and norms.
Thank you. Brilliant. Now, Ben, obviously your business is all over the continent, so you really understand the cultural differences between doing business from country to country. And so what is some of the stuff that you've seen?
Yeah, June, for us, it is interesting. For us, Africa clearly is home. It feels like home. And when we operate on a continent, we don't really think that it's too different from a cultural perspective to operating anywhere else. I agree with all the comments made. I suppose the way to look at it from our perspective is that we're dealing with a collection of young, maturing democracies. And when you connect that to the relationship point of view, we all get defined from where we come from. And if you look at the recent history of Africa, that has been somewhat turbulent.
Yes.
The amount of attention now in Africa is disproportionate. And I think it's quite important for everyone, whether it's government, business, small business, individuals, to make sure that we live up to the expectations of this massive wall of money and capital facing off to Africa right now. And so in the vein of relationships, I think it's quite important for all of us to understand that we need to play a role in building the capacity. If you think of central banks or governments, they may be somewhat slower, but they want to make sure that they do the right thing, something that is more sustainable and something that will live to see another day. And so from that perspective, on the one hand, you have to be quite patient, and I think you can do exactly what you do anywhere in the world, but you have to understand that you need to go through that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it is extremely competitive, particularly in our industry. And the competition is completely differently defined in most countries. Some countries, like Uganda, have a disproportionate level of foreign bank participation within the economy. And then you have economies like Nigeria that are completely dominated by domestic banks.
Yeah.
Both of those economies are extremely competitive from a
competitive,
financial
yeah.
services perspective. And so I think if you think of Africa as a backwater where you can do anything, that is not the
That's
case.
not the
You
case,
have to
yeah.
you have to be at a world class. And then when you overlay that with the complexities that you face in terms of infrastructure, which is clearly the biggest driver for us on the continent to properly reap the benefits from the population that we have and the high levels of urbanization happening, I think education is quite
It's
important
key.
for us,
Yeah.
and we need to make sure that we operate at world-class standards, whether it comes to money laundering, financial crime, any of these regulatory items. It has to be at the same level as if you're operating in the UK, for example.
Brilliant. So with your sort of B2C business, are you finding you're having to innovate around technology? Because as Mark referenced with M-Pesa, Africa is way ahead in terms of mobile banking. Is that something that you guys have had to innovate around?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, this is a key focus. We're in a process, particularly in the personal and business part of the bank, to completely turn it into a digital bank from the moment of origination. Wherever you are, you can open an account on an iPad or a phone
Wow.
and make payments in under 10 minutes.
Got a bit of way to go in London
And
on
then
that.
all the way through to the back-end processing, which clearly requires us to make huge investment in technology across all of these continents.
Yeah.
And if we have greater investment in telecommunications, I think there's still a long road ahead. We can leapfrog a lot of this in many of the economies in Africa.
Brilliant. Well, Vimal, over to you. Now, obviously, East Africa is your region. That's where you rule, as it were. So, so you understand the real sort of the cultural differences in terms of doing business over there. What would you say some of them are?
I think very simply, Africa is 54 countries, as we say,
Yes.
but it's 5 regions. It's Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, Central Africa, Western Africa, and North Africa.
Yeah.
North Africa and South Africa, we don't talk about them as
No.
being Africa.
They're not with
We
us.
don't actually.
So everybody in South Africa
Sorry,
has a go-to-Africa market strategy. So when you look at that, it's sub-Saharan Africa, and that's region. So if you look at Eastern Africa, Eastern Africa is one region and everything else is very similar in that
Yes.
sense. So if you take the East African community, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and Ethiopia now included,
Yeah.
you know, all that becomes much bigger than Nigeria as a region.
Yes.
We've got economies of scale and scope because it's free market there, free trade. Plus we've got a common external tariff. So the customs union there also
Yeah,
allows
yeah.
free trade.
Yes.
So from a small fragmented market of Kenya being 44 million and Tanzania and Uganda, now it's East Africa. So if you're going to Rwanda now, you're not saying it's 10, 12 million people, it's
Yeah.
150 million people.
In aggregating that whole region.
Today.
Yeah.
When you look at it from a 2030 perspective, that's another 250 million people market. So the question is, if you go to any of these countries, you're going to a regional market.
Yes.
Laws are being harmonized, systems are being harmonized. Today, I think in the next 12 months, we'll have even VAT harmonized. Right now, the customs duties are harmonized. So even the standards, Bureau of Standards and all that stuff is harmonized.
We still have the issues with travel, intra-country travel. It's
No,
not
it's
simple.
changed. You can get one visa and you can travel across East Africa.
Right.
Right? And 3 countries have already implemented it. I think the rest are just coming on board.
Okay.
So East Africa will be easy to travel with.
Yes.
Again, you just take one visa. We don't need any visas now.
Yeah.
Again, free movement of people's happening. Kenyans can work in Rwanda
Yeah.
without any work permit. Rwandans can work here.
Wow.
So I think that's happened a lot. So free
Yeah.
movement's going to happen. With that, intertrade is going to happen. Now, we've got the demographics, we've got the growth rates of our populations. If you take all these growth rates, then you talk about internet, we've got last mile fiber optics, and that's changed the way we work. So banking is done from wherever you are, not from your office.
Yes.
It's done from your mobile phone.
Yes.
Right? Most banks are now on mobile phones. You can do all your transactions there. So that's also happened. I think we've leapfrogged in a lot of places.
For sure.
And going forward, we don't need to employ the slow learning curve that we've gone through or you've gone through in Europe or in the West. And that's why if you see those graphs, you see the developing, you call them developing markets, but I call them submerging markets, that's the West. And the emerging,
Cola.
the emerging markets are just coming up. So when one is submerging, the other one is emerging.
Cola, do you want to say anything to that?
It's just clear. Africa's got an opportunity compared to other parts of the world. We've got a plain sheet of paper today to redraw the future of the continent.
Yeah.
We've got youthful population, and more importantly, global capital is no more the exclusive of the industrialized nations.
No.
Global capital needs returns,
Yeah, and
and effective returns
and
you
the
find in
growth is
Africa.
there, yeah.
So if you tie it all up, I stay with you. You know, we're not emerging. We're emerged market that's giving returns to potential investors and investors on the continent, and that is
And
why
submerging
you see
too.
global financial institutions, you see sovereign wealth funds, you see the private equity funds.
Yeah.
It's sexy today to do something.
Get a slide there.
Can we get the slide on the screen?
It's
Brilliant.
sexy today to talk about Africa. We're investing in
The
Africa.
orange
We're
one
raising
is
an Africa
orange
fund.
one is Africa, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go.
Submerged.
Submerging.
So when you look at that, it's a reality.
Yeah.
Demographics, people, demand. The other thing is our roads not okay, our infrastructure is not okay.
No.
That's the opportunity.
But that's the opportunity. Yeah.
You can't say, oh no, until your roads get fixed, your water gets fixed, your power gets fixed, then Jay will have no business there. Right? GE won't be able to put a power plant. So the opportunities in that sector right now are coming up.
Yeah.
Then you talk about what Ben talked about, urbanization. What does urbanization mean? Today we are 33% urbanized. We're going to be 64% urbanized by
Yeah.
2030.
Yeah.
Do you know what that means?
Yeah.
That means huge consumption. That
Yes.
means clustering.
Yes.
That means demand for a lot of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
whereas when we were in the US recently, we asked, "What's your 2030 plan for the US?" And people said, "What 2030 plan?" We don't even have that.
No, Africa, that's a
So I'm just saying,
2030
when you
plan.
look at Africa, that's a big opportunity. Now the question is, if you have capital and if you want returns, that's where the returns are. But I think the risk profiling for a lot of people who have the Western eyesight or
Yes.
Western mindset. Is too risky, it's too
Yeah.
dark. Yes, we don't have everything on Google. We don't have everything online. Your statistics, like I think Jay talked about, he can't have his turnover online because the opportunities are there and a lot of people don't want those opportunities to be seen by others. So there's not a scramble yet, but I think going forward, you're going to see a lot more people coming in there. And I think right now people are trying to understand what is Africa, where is Africa.
Where are the opportunities?
You got to say East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, and then you look at it from that perspective and really say which countries. Now the reforms that are happening there are massive. If you just look at Kenya, for example, the whole government's been reformed. There's a whole national government, judiciary separate, parliament separate. We got counties. We got a hybrid model like U.S. Now that's where we got governors and stuff like that. When you look at all that's happening, these reforms are not reversible. They're not going to go back to the old big man
Syndrome.
like the Zim type of where big ruler sort of rules and you have a problem.
Yeah.
You're not going to see that anymore. And parliament's getting much more powerful. Democracies are in. And,
Gender parity.
And really, genders also.
Yeah, huge.
We've got gender
We are
equality
way
coming in.
yeah.
We have a rule in Kenya, 1/3 must be another gender.
Wow.
So this panel is not constituted properly.
No. I'd agree with that.
What are the three genders that make up a third?
Jay, there's operations for that.
No, it's one third either. But I'm just saying, overall, I think we need to see that. And, need to feel the pulse.
Well, I'll go ahead to you, Mark. Obviously, Vimal was talking about infrastructure opportunities. What are the sorts of areas that you are looking at in terms of investment? And where have you had successes and where have you had failures?
So we've been looking at Africa since 2009, and we've been investing since 2010. And the approach really is one of looking at the long-term opportunities and identifying the people that we want to do business with, because once you are comfortable with a group or a company, you will tend to do more business. So, you know, we're doing things in the extractive industries and mining and oil and gas, both onshore and offshore. We're doing some stuff in retail, and also we're doing stuff in real estate. Because if you think about it, the commanding heights of every emerging market is banking and real estate. And that you don't have to be a rocket scientist for that one. So those are complex areas, particularly real estate, because you have title and other associated issues with governance. But there you have to be involved with hotels, you know, offices and housing. And those are the sort of things we do, you know, in different countries.
Which countries are you in?
We've done stuff in Nigeria. We've done stuff with one of our partners in Luanda. In oil and gas, we've done stuff in Cameroon and other places, actually. So about 6-7 countries that we've done, and also some small mining things in South Africa.
And by long term, how long do you see those investments being until you're able to exit on them?
Well, that depends. There are some exits that you can have sooner than later. Let's be clear, a lot of the private equity guys have not had exits yet.
No.
So for many people who look at it from the private equity perspective,
there
isn't this long list of exits.
Yeah.
But you just have to, you have to subscribe to the cash flow theory. I'm going to collect my returns over time. And if you're looking to flip, not sure that's the right place to be.
That's the right place to be. You've got to take the long-term view. Yeah. Okay, so Jay, as the CEO of a major multinational, so what do you think, in terms of your perspective, how have you seen things change for how long you've been in Africa?
Well, I mean, I've been there about 4 years now, and I would say the changes that you're seeing, I mean, Vimal talked about Kenya from a standpoint of governance. The government changes in some countries have been positive. You look at the Nigerian power privatization scheme that they are going through, which is going to really revamp the whole power generation capability in that country. And you see a lot of different things in a lot of different countries from that perspective. So I think governance continues to improve, which is great. I think one of the things that to me is probably the unsung hero of Africa going forward is going to be innovation.
100%.
And innovation, there's a couple of things here. One is there is a very strong entrepreneurial culture and people that have great ideas and have designed a lot of good things.
There's a need.
There's definitely a need. And then the normal thing from a standpoint of, to Mark's point, the capital markets of, IPOs and all that stuff just don't exist there yet. So a lot of these guys are still developing these products, and they're really, really some very innovative things. Obviously, M-Pesa is one on mobile money. But if you think about what, necessity is the mother of invention. When you think about healthcare and you think about transmitting images, et cetera, typically everything that gets done in developed world, you have great landlines and capability to go through that way. In Africa, we got telecom and mobile. And our mobile situation in most countries is as good as anywhere. And that is the way you do business and the way, and number one. And number two is you're able to, at least in the healthcare segment, utilize practitioners that are out away from the experts, let's say. But you can do it with the mobile technology to transmit images, transmit, we're training nurse midwives to use a handheld ultrasound to do triage on pregnant mothers to see if they need breech or whatever, they need to go to birthing centers or whatever. And I think those are the kind of things that you can't do everywhere else, and no one else will think about it, but because we have this necessity, it drives innovation. And now what we see is a lot of these things that we've developed for Africa, product-wise, wants to be used elsewhere. So, so I think that's going to be that's one of the, I would say, silver linings that people don't really see. And that's going to sustain, I believe, and it's to what was said earlier, I don't want to see, African to do a bunch of metal bending.
No.
I think manufacturing can take a leapfrog. We know the technology, we have the abilities, and we can train people around that. And I think that's a big thing, because that lowest, and because quite frankly, Africa is not a low-cost place to do business.
No.
All of the labor rates that are lower gets eaten up with all the logistical power, et cetera, issues that make the cost of the product higher. So I think that that aspect of innovation and really really utilizing the technology is going to be key.
And also in terms of sustainability, it's a blank canvas we can
And you do things today. There are things today that you can. There's KPLC in Kenya. They have a capability to put power into the slums, and then you pay for it by the hour through the mobile money
in advance.
So you buy $1 worth of power so your kids can study at night.
Prepaid.
Wow.
And then you can do all that because mobile money is the implementer to make the enabler to make that happen. So the stuff's going on in the rural areas around solar, the same kind of thing. And so all of a sudden, this is new technology that, for combination of the mobile money along with the technology that's traditional, if you will, and I think it'll really change the game.
And technology that will then travel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So Kolo, what are your plans and strategies in terms of scale?
We're still trying to do is this. We see a massive opportunity in the top end of the African rejuvenation as we see it. And one strategy we've followed is where the major multinationals that's been in Africa by legacy position are exiting the market. And we're sneaking in and just taking over these assets and buying these assets and buying these businesses. Because something is missing. And what they've got missing is what we understand. We know the lay of the land, we understand the market, and we understand the workings of the structures locally today. So I'll give you an example. Shell, or the major oil companies, are selling assets onshore Nigeria. There's nothing wrong with these assets. The only thing is they've got a security issue, which started about 10, 12 years ago. It's not a problem to us because I've got that local knowledge of the area. So I could interact and interface better with the local communities.
And not have that same issue.
That same issue. So today, we've been in there producing for 3 years, and our production is over 60,000 barrels a day.
Wow.
Shell shut this field down for over 8 years.
And
So
have you had any security problems?
we have, but the
you know how to
difference is just the
manage them.
engagement. You see,
Yeah.
don't forget this security issues that's been made out to the world didn't start today. It started back then, but the world changed. So level of engagement in global corporations refused to change somewhat. But we as a smaller, nimble business, we're able to change the ways of engagement in managing the localities of these businesses and interfacing with the local communities. And that's worked well in our favor, but more importantly is understanding the local complexities
Yes.
and being able to get involved. One major thing you find with global corporates, and this is where huge opportunities come on the continent, is the bigger you get, the more complex the ways of doing business becomes.
Yeah.
Because they've got rules and regulations that's stipulated in the Bible.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? But as a smaller, nimble
And much
business,
more bureaucracy. Yeah.
in it, right? But I'll give you a
Making me
typical.
feel like an old man.
Sorry.
No, Jay. No, Jay.
Different with you, obviously.
I'll give you a typical example. We had a problem. A field, the straddles us, is run by another major oil company. We had a major blowout. I could make the decision immediately
And how to fix it.
how to fix an intervention. But my counterparty had to refer to head office.
Yeah. Yeah.
To get it done. Now, if you look at the response
time
time,
differences with
the
that.
two villages are very upset. They're happy with us. They're very upset with them, but not because of inaction. It's just because the time to action is delayed. So here lies the opportunity that we see in medium-sized businesses growing as an African in Africa. But then the opportunities even open up more for the larger corporates, like what Jay is doing. You see, they've come with an innovative type of business, financing infrastructure in Africa. Now, we couldn't do that.
No.
But they've come with the Power Africa, a lot of very nice structures that will deliver infrastructure that makes sense on the continent.
And that benefits people like you.
Absolutely. So there is an opportunity to interfit our business as an African, growing businesses on the continent and seizing opportunities with a big business that should be doing much bigger business so it can benefit me, and in turn I can create more in the chain. So there is a value chain in the myriad of opportunities that sits on the continent.
That can be complementary.
It is hugely complementary. One major thing you should always think about is Africans are very entrepreneurial. If you could think of the continent growing today at 5%, and we've got 90% deficit right across the chain from power to roads, rail, travel. So just imagine the growth, the rate of growth of this continent
with that.
If we have 50%. This is the opportunity. So for me, what I say to the world is this: capital is not missing. What is missing is the drivers of change, who are people sitting around this room, who makes decisions on where to apply capital. Those are the people that needs to be convinced that Africa is the destination, but the most important part of it is the only place you can find effective returns today.
Yeah, but long term, as Mark said. So Ben, is that what you're advising the U.S. institutional investors that are wanting to get in on the action in Africa?
Yeah, perhaps if I make a few comments, because I think we might be at the other end of the scale as a very old organization on the African continent, but relatively new in the development. We tend to think of our business along three dimensions, and all of it centered around clients and customers. At the first level, when we think about our clients and customer businesses, the second component would be our business, and then the third dimension would be what we need to do to be sustainably relevant in the economies where we operate, and actually help these economies grow. So going back to the first component in terms of our client approach, in the corporate investment bank, we have a deep sector specialization in what we think are the key drivers of growth on the continent. And so for us, that would be power and infrastructure. We see that every single day. And then very closely related to that would be the extractive industries, metals and mining, and oil and gas. And all of those require a fairly large amount of infrastructure investment, but they're often facilitators for infrastructure investment. Big mining ventures on the continent can create that. The next levels of specialization for us is telecommunications, and that's been a leapfrogging exercise across the continent, and we have spent a lot of time on that in recent times. In more recent times, we have focused more on property, which is a very interesting sector right across the continent. Health is becoming very important, and education is becoming very important. And then a critical area for us to be relevant is in the lives of multinationals that operate on the continent, to be a partner of choice for these entities. If I then step back into our own business, and this most probably slots almost into that, for us to be really effective on the continent, we need to make sure that we can actually use our balance sheet in a way that leverage it properly for our customers. So we would have a balance sheet of about $140 billion on the African continent. Of that, about $100 billion would be represented by loans and advances to individuals or multinationals or corporate and domestic enterprises. And then about $40 billion of our balance sheet is actually aimed at institutions, investment companies, and investors or trade partners that operate on the continent that are looking for risk mitigation products, whether it's interest rate, currencies, whatever the case may be. And that really is a very critical component of developing the capital markets with sovereigns, with multinationals, local corporates, and a key focus for us as we progress. We do a lot of work with the central banks, and not just how to manage the reserves that they have, but how to think about cash flow management so that they can pay dividends and facilitate the transfer of foreign currency and so forth. And then perhaps if I move on to the third dimension, if you talk to the Minister of Finance or a central bank governor in any country, there are certain things that are very close to them. Many of these economies rely extensively on agriculture as a job creation and rural stability in many of the places.
And we'll do even more so.
And agriculture is a very difficult thing for banks to do. It's easy to do it at the high end, but as you progress down, you need to think about that quite differently. And that is a key focus for everyone. Another key focus area in order to alleviate poverty is clearly job creation and small and medium enterprises. Is really quite critical. And many of the exposures that you take on there is almost more of an equity-related risk as opposed to lending risk. And you need to think about that very proactively in how you deal with that. And that is a key focus for us. And then I think what we try to do is we try to make sure that the entire value chain come together. If I simply explain it, if you start with a multinational, you would have a supply chain and a distribution chain. And in the distribution and supply chain, you would have smaller enterprises that actually you can then much easier bank. And then if you draw a cloud around that and think of all the employees and communities that benefits from that, again, you have a much more natural component of that. And so the final component of this is financial inclusion and how you deal with people on the continent. If I look at sub-Saharan Africa, credit extension is only 12%. And so there's an enormous opportunity. But as you know, in today's world, anything that is a big opportunity, there's a good reason for that. And so one has to think about the challenges associated with this. And so for us, if I look at this, I think clearly you have a huge population, urbanizing, growing in maturity, better educated every year, very good macro stability, and the portfolio effect of very different countries. If anything go wrong, or if a country has a difficult period like you've seen in Ghana in recent times, with a portfolio you can weather that. And the input and the exit mechanisms are actually much easier and better defined and more liquid than it's been for ever.
Forever, yes, for a long time. So Vimal, what are the actual risks versus perceived risks in terms of growing a business in Africa? And then the other thing which I think would be interesting to get your perspective on is you grew the business from the ground up. What are the difficulties for SMEs to be able to scale? So if you could deal with those two questions, that'd be good.
I think when you look at it in terms of risks, the risk is always perceived, right? Yeah. It just depends on which angle you're looking at it. I'm born and brought up there, so I look at it from a different perspective, whereas a multinational sitting here in the UK would look at it differently. As far as we're concerned, operating risks, financial risks, all that stuff, whatever insurable risks are coverable, right? You can insure everything. In fact, political risks today you can cover through MIGA or ATI or whatever. So really, when you look at those sort of original old risks, investors can cover them. Most people are not taking out that insurance. They're not taking out political cover, all that stuff, because it's a 1.7%, and they say it's not that risky. So, it's not that bad. But then when you look at from a risk of, what is the biggest risk? It's credit risk, right? Yeah. Non-payment or whatever. Therefore, you make sure you have differences in terms of due diligence. Yes. When we supply to our customers, we got to make sure that they've got the ability to pay. Yeah. But banking, for that matter, they actually do only asset financing. They don't do working capital financing, which is based on non-asset. They want to have a land title or some property there, and then they give you 50% of that. So very prudent, but very conservative, and therefore risk-free. Whereas here you would get on your working capital.
Depends on the customer.
Here you would get money on your working capital, just just as a matter of fact.
Just a matter of fact.
It's a difference. So apart from that, risks, I think because of the costs being too high, the margins are high. So it's a high cost economy, but high margin economy.
Yes.
Risk reward ratio.
Yeah.
Now, that's the opportunity.
Yeah.
The opportunity there is to be able to bring this down and lower it. As the risks get lower and lower, the pricing will come down, the productivity will improve, and of course, margins will become down. But what I see a lot of people here doing, excuse me if you're in a PE fund or whatever, they're looking at a 5-year period and say, fine, I'm going in there, I'm punting for 5 years, and I'm going to make 25, 30% return per annum, and that's it. In 5 years, I'm out, right? Now, I look at it from a perspective of sitting on the other side. I'm an operator there. Why wouldn't I sell to any of these guys? Because they would come in and say, okay, now how do I exit? 5 years, I got to exit. And they would strip my assets. They would actually strip it apart, pile on a lot of leverage, and then say, fine, let's sell this company to get your 25, 30%. Some people want 40% in 5 years' time. Now here I am. I'm saying I want to grow the company. I want to make it bigger all over Africa. Our goal is to grab, grow, and sustain all over Africa. #1 market share. Now, with that growth strategy, there's no patient capital coming in. We have about 40 to 50 different, PE funds in Nairobi looking for deal flow. And they complain to me and say, we can't get deal flow. Where's the deal flow? I said, there's a mismatch. There's a lot of people who would go to that route. If you went and said, I've got 10, 15-year money, they would come in with you. But if you said, no, I want 25%, I want 5 years, that's it. I got an LP at the back, forget it. And that's the point.
Everything you've been saying, Mark.
So this is where it needs to change to say, the guys who are investors, because people sell rosy industries. They say, oh, we got 25% return, 5 years' time, you get your money back, you're in and out. It's a punt. I think you've got to change this. Africa is not a punt, a test case or whatever. It's another place where you can make money. And your returns in 10, 15 years' time, annualized, would be even more than 25%. But it's got to have a term to it, right? Because there's a lot of development involved in that. As economies grow, as the infrastructure gets built, as power becomes available, just the story of power being available, the amount of productivity that improves.
It's a game changer.
It's massive. All that stuff. When you look at a lot of roads and all that stuff, access, agribusiness, we're into agribusiness ourselves. And agribusiness, 60% of the unused arable land is in Africa.
It's in Africa, yes.
It's a McKinsey report, you can see it online. Now, the question is, we've had a lot of potential in Africa. Potential, it doesn't put food on our tables. We've got to turn that into action and say, fine, make it happen. Who's going to do it? I don't believe it's going to be the West. I think it's going to be Africans sitting in Africa saying, let's do it. And if they need to partner up with capital from elsewhere, fine. The biggest issue that we have in Africa is capital formation or lack of capital formation. We just can't form capital because if you want to get $1 billion for Africa, I talked to somebody in Wall Street and said, take you 2 years. In the US, $1 billion, 1 week. That's the difference. So I'm just saying, capital formation is a big problem for us. So we couldn't think big in the past. But now I can tell you what's happening is, our governments are thinking bigger. Our people are thinking bigger and saying, we can do mega projects, including power pools, including opening up our countries and saying, we're bigger. And that's the whole wind of change. Today, I think the Kenyan government issued a bond, right? And they went for 2 billion. And they were scared. 2 billion might be difficult, all that stuff. They got 8 billion. Wow. And now today, the pricing has gone down from 6.5% to 5.25%. And it's there. So the risk perceptions are changing. And I think as we develop and as we improve, as that graph goes, we're going to be much more better off. People are going to change. The other thing is, I think it's important for people to feel the pulse. A lot of people who are investors in the US or the West have not been to Africa. And they perceive it that we're still living on trees and, all that sort of stuff. So we've got to get out of that concept. Let's go down there and see the places because it's developing. The last thing I want to say is we're leapfrogging in every technology.
We really
in our industry right now, we employ the best in world-class equipment. We operate at world-class standards. We've got all the ISOs you can talk about. We're signatories to the UN Global Compact. We operate with Kaizen, which means we remove wastage. So it's the same thing as you would operate here. I mean, smartphones today, we've given all our people smartphones and they do their transactions online from a smartphone. It's linked to SAP, it's real-time online. Now, I went to some other developed countries and say, we haven't developed that yet here. Why? Because our payments system, the banks are blocking it, or the governors are blocking it, and we've opened up. So I'm just saying, there's a lot of leapfrogging that can be done there. So don't think I've got a second-class plant here, I can ship it out to Africa and operate for me.
That's the old way of doing it.
So get efficient, put in real efficient plants, which use less water, less utilities, and really are best in class. And therefore, you just don't have a problem. I think the economies can be achieved. And really, it's like when we bought over the Unilever business, right, in Kenya, they were saying we've got a path to growth and we're going out of this place, out of that market. Today, 20 years later, they're saying we're now coming to put up a plant. So that's the difference. And I think
Same with what you're doing.
it's about the long-term perspective because of the emerging market and submerging markets.
Yeah, completely. And I'd just love to get your perspective in terms of SMEs. You know, the driving engine of any economy is the middle class.
SMEs.
And that's the toughest place to get capital, that missing middle.
It's not. Sorry, I disagree. I think
disagree?
SMEs are able to survive. They're developing. All the banks are lending to SMEs.
But to access capital in...
They have access to capital like crazy. I can tell you what, just look at Equity Bank in Kenya, Standard Bank, look at, I shouldn't mention KCB, all the other banks. They are lending to SMEs and there's a lot of money there. Yes, the only issue is the interest rates are very high.
Yes.
They're close to 40%.
Yes.
That's the problem, right? That's the problem. But SMEs can get a lot of money today, and really, that's happening. So there's a lot of incubation happening there, a lot of people getting money. The question is, a lot of people still think a government job is something important.
Right.
And governments have come to their limits in terms of jobs. So there's a lot of youth coming out, like Kenya alone, 1 million people going to the job market every year. So we've got to make sure we create that many jobs. And therefore, things are opening up. But I think the urbanization, the requirements of housing, just look at the housing requirements, low-cost housing, medium-cost housing. It's massive. We're putting up a new city just outside Nairobi, Tano City, and I can tell you the demand is massive.
I can imagine.
The returns are crazy.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you. We have time for probably 2 or 3 questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? What? Oh, we have a microphone, actually. And if you could tell us your name and where you're from and who your question is directed to.
Hi, Nick Williams at Credit Suisse, and it's directed to the whole panel, or just people's views. I think someone said up front, the required infrastructure spend in Africa is $2 trillion a year.
Yeah.
And the question is that definitely the non-specialist I have is how much do you think you're currently getting of that $2 trillion requirement? Because part of this is all about unlocking value and having the infrastructure investment.
Kola, do you want to start first? And then
I'll give you an example. I got interviewed at the World Economic Forum in Africa in Abuja, and the interviewer asked me, are we making a lot of progress in Nigeria on power? And I said, how many babies were born in the last hour that we've been talking? How many people have joined the middle class, and how many megawatts have been brought on stream? We are not even close to the deficit that gets talked about is getting deeper because we don't have the speed of getting a lot of this stuff, this infrastructure in. And it's not part of it's an execution issue of once you put a shovel into the ground to get things going, but a lot of it's just in the, if power project average takes 7 years, 2 years of that's construction.
Right.
5 years of that is getting negotiations back and forth, and that's speed. Every day that somebody sits on a desk somewhere not getting done or whatever is another day that we fall further behind.
Yeah.
And I think that dynamic, we talk about South Africa having a power deficit. They've got half the power in the sub-Saharan region in South Africa for 40 million people.
Wow.
And the other 700 million have got the same amount. And meanwhile, they have a power deficit, and they're not growing as fast as the rest of the continent. So I think, Nigeria has the same amount of power that the state of Montana does in the United States, with 1 million people, and there's 160 or 70 million in Nigeria. So there's a huge deficit, just power. Then logistics, healthcare, roads, rail, So there's a lot of opportunity, and we love it.
I think that there's innovative ways that's happening right now. If I just talk about Kenya, Kenya's just doing a 3,000-kilometer road thing, and it's aiming to go to 10,000 kilometers. They're doing it complete private sector. They're actually telling you, come design, build, finance, own, operate the roads, and build them up. And they're allocating these, and they've got huge applications. 7 of the top 10 were Chinese, right? Because they come with the capital and they come with the money and the financing. But I'm just telling you, a lot of people in the West probably haven't even seen these opportunities. Yeah. They're planning to do the same thing for roads now. I think healthcare, G is doing a lot of there's a lot of possibilities. Healthcare, infrastructure, power, agribusiness, a huge amount of privatization. Plus, if you see the power operations in Kenya, for example, the generators are different. You can be a private generator. The distribution is controlled. But the generators, you can be, I think we got a generator just now in front of us here. So there's a lot more possibilities.
Cool. All right, okay. Cool, Paul. Yeah, we do.
I am
And then
Paul
you
Hinks.
after.
I'm the CEO of, I've just kicked a cup. I'm the CEO of a company called Symbian Power, which, yes, does generation. So I want to make a point, but, or not make a point, I want to ask a question of the panel. Before I do that, I just want to point out something to Vimal. You said, who's my good friend, by the way, you said that we still think that people in Africa live in trees or something like that.
Generally. I didn't say you.
No. But I want to point. I want to point out something to you, Vimal. That we stopped wearing flared trousers in about 1972.
Are you sure? Paul, I heard they're back in.
Let me just ask the question. Make the point I want. You know, I travel around Africa like you all do. And I constantly hear at these events that we attend, you know, there's a lack of developers, there's a lack of investors for the private equity and banks to get behind. But what I see all over the continent is lots of really smart people who've got great ideas, and if they had the money to develop their ideas, there would be a lot more going on. So my question is, you know, when a guy can't even afford to do a little study or something like that, and I know that there's development institutions out there to do those sort of things, but is there anything that we as businessmen and women and companies and funds, is there anything we can do to facilitate that small business person there
to do feasibility studies,
to get his project off the ground and help him?
Who wants to answer that one? And
Yes,
you
you
have
can.
a question after. So we've got two final questions. This one and then that one, and then that's it. Who's going to answer that question?
Do you want to take the...
I can answer that.
Who's
I
going for Mark?
I think what we can do is innovate, number one. Identify what is the problem and really fill that gap, because it's a gap. Capital is not available to the people who need it. There are lots of people who have ideas. I tell you, when we started off, we couldn't get the capital to raise. It's been 29 years. And today, banks are coming and saying, here, how much money do you want? You know, it's not a problem. But startup is an issue, and capital is not available for some startups. But then it goes back to partnerships, and that's where partnerships can work. But we can talk about that separately.
We have a capacity building kit, which we call a starter kit for people starting new businesses, that on your mobile or app take you through what you should consider. How do you get licenses? How do you deal with finance? How do you do all of that?
Do you give them the money too?
Yeah.
Or loan them?
Yeah, we do.
You
not
said
at,
it
and not
depends
at
on who the
40%.
customer is.
So that's the microfinance.
That lady here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sandra, and I work at the Charities Aid Foundation. I'm an investment manager. I'm not going to make any comments about the attire of the panel, but I just have a quick economic about trousers.
Oh yeah, all right.
I just have a quick question about economic development, and in particular, what the panelists are seeing with regards to the interaction between the private sector and the development sector. So, for example, are you seeing development finance institutions as a potential supply for that patient capital gap?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, in many regards, we work with some of the development finance institutions. It clearly depends on the term structure of debt and the combination of the different levels of capital that you would need in certain projects. And there clearly is a role for many of these institutions to play, but they tend to focus on things that are perhaps not private sector. You know, they focus on developmental type of projects, which often can become extremely bankable with the assistance of institutions such as that, and it is quite a big part in many of our businesses.
Well, Rockefeller has a similar
But the
project
truth
with
is-
Tony Illuminated, don't they?
The truth is they're analysis paralysis. They analyze for 2-3 years and then try and start a project. DFIs, we don't, in the private sector, hardly people use DFIs.
I think the other thing about developmental capital is, one of the things, there's too much different types of capital chasing the same deals.
Right.
And if you think of different value chains, just take the power value chain for a minute and go from fuel to distribution. And And the power generation is probably easiest to get private capital around, especially if you've got some kind of a guarantee or whatever on the power purchase agreement and on the gas or whatever the fuel supply might be. And that's where the development capital can play, is on these other areas that make this part more bankable. And then which then makes their bankable. I think that's a dynamic that can happen. But when you have developmental banks in the power generation piece doing IPPs, it's really not where they belong. We need that capital, to your point, be about patient capital in the areas that are difficult for private sector finance to come into.
Right. Final question?
Thank you. My name is Tarek. I'm from Ghana, and I've been an investor for the last 6 years in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm currently setting up an SME bank in Ghana. So just to lay the foundations that I know a lot about the SME space. And I brought an example with me here on the right, my friend Caleb, who I will point to you afterwards, actually, Mr. Vimal. So I have a quick question in terms of, well, more of a statement in terms of what the lay of the land is. Over the last 2 years, I've worked with a lot of DFIs. I've spoken to a lot of the private equity firms as well. I'm currently fundraising, working with a lot of venture capital funds, setting up something that would have a large social and economic impact in Ghana on its own, providing long-term growth capital to SMEs, which I think is the key word there, because you can get short-term financing that's really not an issue. A lot of the microfinance institutions that do provide SME financing in Ghana finance between 60 and 110%. Of course, there's some idiosyncrasies to Kenya, since our base rate's 20% and inflation's 15%, so that's slightly different. But my main concern is that, having spoken to a lot of these CFIs, a lot of the large private equity firms, a lot of people who are flocking money into the continent, and it's gone up from about 40 million to about 250 billion, over the last 10 years. A lot of the money, as has been rightly pointed out, is in long-term infrastructure play. A lot of the money kind of goes into high cash flow businesses, since exits are difficult. It goes into infrastructure, goes into oil and gas, it goes into extractives, etc. What my biggest concern is that there's a huge lag for the middle class, as you pointed out, June, for SMEs, who are the foundation, they're the taxpayers, they're the voters, they're the foundation of social and economic growth. As a big divide, a big inequality sort of widens, why aren't institutions actually taking any risk to actually lend and support SMEs on the continent? That's my first question. My second question, yes, there is SME financing in sub-Saharan Africa. My friend Caleb set up a business about three years ago. It's cash flow positive. He's looking for a loan in Cameroon, and the only way he was able to get one is under the condition that 125% has to be collateralized in order for him to get a loan that's actually digestible when it comes to an interest rate. So I'm just kind of curious as to what you think the long-term play, because, you know, Africa Rising, we keep on hearing it now. It's going to be a fad in 10 years' time. Who knows what the next big flux of FDI is going to happen. What about the rest of us? What about the foundation? What about the sustainability of actually building a middle class that actually grows the economy, if we have to be self-reliant?
And that's the only way to be sustainable. Well, Vimal, you didn't think there was a problem in that area.
No, I think he's right. Short-term capital for startups is available. There's enough available, there's no problem. But long-term, if they start talking about 5, 10, 20 years, there's no capital available there. Even including mortgages, just not available. So when you look at that, that's opportunity. I'm just saying, there's instruments you've got in the West that are really, really
robust,
good, and that could be used out there. And I think it's just innovation in finance.
But to be fair, in the West, there isn't a surfeit of capital for SMEs either. So I think you have to nuance that conversation. So the banks, by definition, are traditional institutions. They've obviously lost a lot of money in the funky stuff doing things around the world. So now they're imposing tougher, more stringent conditions because they're able to, because the demand for capital is greater. So the solution is not really to prize money out of the banks or to bring in private equity money. The solution will be peer-to-peer lending, different forms of lending that will facilitate the growth of these businesses. I don't think you're going to look for the traditional model there.
One of the areas that I will touch on is where we've seen the gap. The gap is there. But as a business growing on the continent, what we've been able to do is extend some of our lines down the chain to support that value chain. But it is difficult, because one critical area is they start up business, they don't have security, so you're open. And more often than not, we lose our money. But that's the position we've decided to take. But how sustainable is it? So that's a very difficult point to look at. But it is what it is. There are the opportunities, and as we've touched on them all, from the infrastructure to the power and the whole mix in itself, one thing is clear: Africa's got an opportunity to right the position it should be in the global order. We've got youth, and more importantly, there's something people fail to see in the West.
Drive
And innovation of what mobile technology has been and brought to the continent.
Yes.
A typical example, what this is doing to education on the continent. I have staff who have never been to school. And just, can you imagine how they recognize my number and call me? That's the level this penetration is going on the continent. Now we've got staff who have never been to school that could send and string sentences and send in texts.
Yeah.
This is the level of what the future of Africa holds. And this is the big difference on the continent is this. We need to sell our story. We need to sell our story to the world of decision makers who could invest that capital on the continent. And more importantly, the world is growing, but the strongest part of us is looking at those decision makers who understands and wants to be there with us in making it happen on the continent. And for me, we see it happening. We're innovative. We're out there. We're young. There's youth around us, and we want to work to make it work. So correcting the wrongs on the continent, there's no point dwelling on old stories. Let's move on. And let's rebuild a continent that's got values, based on all international norms and standards, but it's got people that wants to drive innovation and make it work.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, on that
I think
note,
exciting story is that there is a huge demand. It's a very good problem to have where there's a supply side constraint.
Yeah.
It's demand, where demand is high. Growth is high. I mean, what else do you want? You want growth.
Well, on that note, I will draw this panel to a close. I think the exciting thing is, Africa is the birthplace of humanity. We are all African. And the wonderful thing is that this is an opportunity for us to all work together to right the wrongs of the past and create a real example of global unity for the world. So thank you all for joining us. And make a lot of money in the process.